Welcome to Shop Talk Live, episode number 279. Today, Mike and I are joined by former Shop Talk Live co-host and editor of Fun Woodworking magazine, Asa Christiana. And Asa's here to tell us a little bit about his book, Make More Stuff with Wood, and to answer some listener questions, such as, how do you go about fairing a curve? Are tool libraries a good way for woodworkers to get started in woodworking? And a hand plane issue that seems to be a little bit more complicated than we give it credit for at first. Great episode for you. If you are the type of person who likes to give books for the holiday season, Asa's book is going to be a banger for you. If you're trying to help people get into woodworking, if you know someone who, is kind of interested but doesn't know where to begin, Asa's two books, Build Stuff with Wood and Build More Stuff with Wood, would be a great place to get them started. And you'll hear more about it in this episode. But I just want to put it out there. This is a good gift for many, many people in your life, I think. All right, on with the show. So, Asa, you mentioned before we started a book, a new book.
Yeah, I don't have a copy in my hand yet, but all right. So, are we started? Are we actually going?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. Yeah. So tell us about this book.
All right. So it's the second of a series a 3-book series that I've been planning. They've let me do 2 so far, and we'll see how sales go and whether they let me do the third. But the first one was, as some people know, was Build Stuff with Wood, which is right here. And it's really a series that I'd always been imagining when I was working at Fun Woodworking for years. Mike, as Mike knows, and you probably know, I focused a lot of my own personal writing on beginners. For a variety of reasons that we can go into. But I really love teaching beginners and like making the tent bigger, and like I just think that making things with your hands is so fundamentally human. And it's kind of like the antidote to some of the problems we have today with living on screens so much and everything. I mean, we're already converts, and I think everyone listening to this podcast is a convert, but I think there's a lot of people out there who have never had that deep satisfaction of like making something really worthwhile in the kind of analog world. And so I'd always dreamed of making a book for beginners, and the ones I had seen in the past fell short in like one of 2 ways. Either they would claim that the stuff was awesome. Let's say the projects were really awesome, and they'd claim that they were doable, but they really weren't. Like either it's like, yeah, my dad helped me, or they were doable with tools that anyone could afford, maybe a beginner could afford, but then they weren't really worth doing. Like they were kind of, just not really great. I want to use a bad word, but they were just kind of junky, or not built well, or not really useful, or whatever. So the sweet spot is like totally worth building, totally doable, and totally worth doing. Right. That's like the sweet spot. So the first book was like, I really want to start. I kind of wrote it for my nieces and nephews who had no shop classes. They just look at me and they're like, I want to do what you do. And so it was really for them. I had them in mind the whole time. And it was like, okay, what do I think is the easiest path into this craft for someone with no tools, no skills, zero? How do you get them to maybe not 0 to hero, but 0 to I can make stuff? So I picked the way that I think is the easiest path in, which is like small handheld power tools, and last time I was on the podcast, we talked about book 1. Really no table saw, no big machines. Really, you have a circular saw as your table saw. You have a jigsaw as your band saw. Little router. I did allow a chop saw, which is not really handheld, but it's still kind of a portable tool.
But it kind of like works its way into it too. It doesn't start with the chop saw.
Right, exactly. And so that was book 1. And I sort of proved to myself and everybody else, and hopefully to the readers, it's been a pretty popular book, that you can make really amazing, awesome, worthwhile stuff with those portable power tools. And honestly, when you talk to a lot of pros, that is how they started. They didn't have access to machinery, and they just kind of, what can I afford when I'm in my 20s or whatever? So And people are so mobile now that, this idea of having all these monster machines isn't really feasible for a lot of people in their 20s and 30s or whatever. So that was book one, and it's project based. Book two just is called Build More Stuff with Wood. Really obvious, hilarious title. And it takes you to the next step. So it adds a table saw. That's the one that just came out. Build More Stuff with Wood. So it adds a small portable table saw. So we get to talk about table saw safety, how to make good cuts, jigs, etc. And a little benchtop sander, that little rigid benchtop sander that a lot of people like and I love. And it adds a little, and it adds a little portable benchtop drill press. And that's and two kinds of serious hand tools. I held those back from book one. In book one, I only really had a pull saw, which is ready to go, easy to use. In book two, it's like real chisels, real block plane. How do you sharpen them? Because they're not going to work at all. So yeah, it's just next level. And all those tools and skills and things let us take on a whole new level of projects, which I'm sure you could post some pics. I'll send you some pics to post with this episode. But you get to do a real workbench. I have some projects lying around here I can show you guys, or you can just post some pics. But yeah, it's like all kinds of amazing things you can make with those very basic tools that won't take up a whole entire garage. And I'm just really committed to sharing this deeply satisfying, profoundly satisfying, valuable hobby with as many people as I can. And since I became a freelancer, since I left the magazine on the full-time basis, moved out to Portland, I was able to write these books. And it's just been like, I've been planning them for 20 years, but now I get to write them,
Yeah, I mean, they're fantastic books. I recommend them highly. It's sort of like someone comes up and says, wow, how do I get started in woodworking? And it's like, you really don't. You really can't. It's like, well, get a house, then get a shop, and then get $10,000 worth of machines, but you haven't even started yet. Now you need hand tools, but but now it's just like, get Asa's first book. Like, that's it. So I think like the two paths into woodworking, one is get a knife and a branch and carve a spoon, or get a chip carving knife and do some chip carving. And your book is really a nice entry into furniture making, actually, making things. And I think it's really invaluable. It's basically everything you can get at a home center, from materials to the tools. Yeah. And like you said, it doesn't insult the reader's intelligence in that, you're just beginning into this craft. That means, you don't have any taste. It's like, no. It's intelligent, passionate, sophisticated people can be coming into something with no skills yet. So I think it does a really good job of really speaking to the level of the reader in terms of skills and knowledge, but also speaking to them in terms of they're smart and they have good taste and they want to make stuff too. And then book two, again, is a really good logical progression. And then once you're done with book two, read my books, and that'll take you.
Yes. Honestly, that's totally right. I made this as an on-ramp to fine woodworking. It's like an on-ramp onto the highway of fine woodworking, which is a really, when we get deep into this craft, we forget how daunting and intimidating it can be to just look at that level right out of the box. And so this is like an on-ramp. And I made it as an on-ramp to the magazine and an on-ramp to your books. That's fully also what I was thinking. And I'm really glad you brought up the materials thing, because book one and book two mostly, but book two, you start to be able, with the table saw, you can actually dimension lumber on a higher level. But in book one, really, it's off the shelf materials, like you said, from the home center or the Ace Hardware lumber rack or whatever, pre-planed, pre-sized. You don't have to do any ripping in book one. So eventually you work your way up to, in book three, I'll try to add I'll add a bandsaw, a joiner, and a planer, and really be able to take control of your materials. But you don't have to have those tools. You can use off-the-shelf materials and make really, really amazing things.
I think that one thing that I've only seen the first book, but one thing that speaks to me about the first book and what you're saying and everything. And I think a lot of the listeners will agree that you don't necessarily, like, I didn't set out to like make furniture. I didn't set out to, I had a broken coffee table and a rickety ladder in the basement, and we needed something for our kitchen. And I said, oh, well, I could put those things together, and boom, like 3 years later, I'm working for Fun Woodworking, right? But you have projects that are, I can make that. They're not daunting. I can, you get started. And like, once you do that one little thing, once you get that one little taste of making something and being proud of it and showing it to your friends and your partner, it grows. And your book, the first book especially, was really, really good at nurturing that curiosity and then feeding it with, here's the next step, here's the next step, so that's why I'm glad to see that there's also like an overall arc between the books. Because if you worked your way through this one, this is the next logical step. So
there's a copy, Asa, there's a copy of your book on Betsy's counter in the office. And, not a lot of people are in there. Barry was in there. We tend to be pretty harsh critics of everything woodworking related,
come on. No.
Period. And so anyway, Barry comes over and says, Mike, did you see Asa's book on the counter? I said, yeah, it's really good.
That's like the nicest thing Barry's ever said.
Yeah.
That's so awesome to hear. Like, this is, I appreciate this so much.
Yeah, it's probably the best testimonial you'll ever get on the back cover. Wow, this is really good. Barry Dima, Fun Woodworking.
I love it. And I love Barry too. Two things that off of what you guys were just talking about, what Ben was just talking about, is that, I think part of the reason the book has sold so well, and I think the second one probably will too, is that fine woodworkers also want to do some fun woodworking. Sometimes the projects, massive, very tricky furniture projects, can take months to finish.
Yeah.
It's just nice to have something that's straightforward. I can pull this off in a weekend. It's going to make me happy. I know I can do it. I'm not swimming in this giant ocean. These are all skills. For someone who's an intermediate, a lot of times they just want the project ideas. They don't really need the techniques as much. They just want like these projects that are quick and easy and fun, but still really, book 2 starts getting into some really serious tables and stools and all kinds of cool stuff, benches. But yeah, they're all, the overarching theme so far is that these projects are more straightforward. I think of it as fun versus fine, but we're getting to fine little by little. We're morphing.
Yeah. That's a great point. Sometimes we'll run an article, maybe on a really simple wall shelf or even a cutting board, and some people might say, that's not fine woodworking. It's like, yeah, but you're going to make that. So, more people are going to make that kind of stuff than the super high style piece that might be more advanced level or people might think is more in keeping with the magazine. I agree. Smart and simple, easy to build, and things that you want to build. It's a really, really tough combination to get right. Yeah.
And bouncing off another thing Ben just said, he was talking about why he started woodworking. It wasn't really to build some grandiose project, And what I think about with these skills, the reason I think they're so empowering, all those portable power tools, a jigsaw, little chop saw and stuff, and the skills you'll build, you can make anything with those. Like part of the reason I like teaching beginners is I'm just as happy building a deck or a garden gate or something as I am, a high style piece of, mid-century modern furniture or something. And I think these tools, these skills, as we all know, we've all worked on our houses and apartments and stuff. It's really great to have a little workshop, some skills and some basic tools. You can do a bunch of things in your house. You end up becoming a remodeler at the same time that you are a woodworker, And so, I really feel strongly that no one should tell anyone else what's cool to build or what is holier than thou enough to build. I think
Right.
it really should just be whatever is in your mind's eye, and you make it, and that's the whole beauty of it.
Yeah.
Right on.
Totally. Well, you know what? This is not the order that I sent them in, but and I never asked them in the order that I sent them in. But let's hit this question from Tim. Hey folks, I love the podcast. As someone who is new to woodworking, the podcast is teaching me a lot. I really enjoyed the episode about building a shop on $1,000 budget. In a recent episode, a questioner asked about the economics of purchasing a planer joiner, and it raised a couple of questions mentioned in the comments in the $1,000 episode. Are tool libraries / community shops a good workaround for the new woodworker who can't afford to purchase some of the pricier machines needed for fine woodworking? I don't hear / read much about this option on finewoodworking.com yet. Any reason why this option doesn't seem to be discussed? So, right off the bat, I think I had never even heard of a tool library until you had brought it up sometime, Asa.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
Talk about a tool library.
Yeah, well, we had one in Portland. I don't know if it's still existent, but I think it's really, if it still exists, but I think it's really important here to differentiate between tool libraries. Tool libraries are like a book lending library. You can go in, you put down some sort of a deposit and your ID or something, and you can take home tools to use for some extended period of time. But that's hard to do with a jointer planer, which the guy was mentioning, I think, in his question. You're not going to bring home a 1,000-pound machine from the tool library. I think they're really, if there is one near you, they're really good for small portable power tools, which is kind of like I think a good path into the craft. But in a community shop, well, let me just say on the tool library front, yeah, you could go and get jigsaws there, and I don't know if I'm a huge fan of them. I think it's good to really just get a taste, but ultimately, a jigsaw is going to cost you $100. A circ saw is going to cost you $100. It's almost, a chop saw might cost you $300. It's almost worth just buying those tools. Use the tool library if you have one in your town to get a little taste. But ultimately, those tools aren't that expensive. You'll use them throughout your whole life. I think sooner or later, you are going to want to just buy those portable power tools that you could get at a tool library. Now, a community workshop, that's a whole other thing. I'm a huge fan of those because that in my area, as Mike knows, he's come and taught at our woodworking guild, which just expanded as a big community shop that just doubled in size. Mike probably doesn't know that, but community shops like a guild shop or like a local place where they'll let you jump on some machinery. Sometimes there are maker spaces and stuff. Now that is a place where you could, I know a lot of people who belong to my woodworking club, Guild of Oregon Woodworkers, that don't own a big wide jointer. They don't own a 16-inch, 20-inch planer. And they only go to the guild because it's a cheap membership fee, and they process all their wood at the guild. So they'll walk in there with all their lumber, and then they go home and they use their hand tools and saws and smaller power tools. So yes, I think a community shop can be an amazing way to get access to machines that you can't afford or can't store or whatever. And it's also a nice social setting just to be around like other people. Our community shop is doing charity projects all the time, which you can go and participate with for free. So it's basically like having a free class. You build something together for charity and you're learning woodworking the whole time. There's just a ton of social and machinery benefits and everything else. I'm a huge fan of trying to get involved in some sort of a community woodworking space. Yeah.
Every tool library that I've seen, like you, Asa, it seems to be more renovation tools.
Right.
Like right now, I'm on our local maker space. They Make Haven in New Haven. They have a tool library, and it's a really cool grouping of like, cordless, DeWalt 18-volt cordless metal shears. Like that's one of those things that I'll maybe need once, but if I do, I could go here. I'm not going to drop $200 on it. Hole saws and a lot of a socket set, a lot of things that if you can't afford these tools and you are in a bind and you need to find a way of getting something done, this is a great option. So I think tool libraries are a wonderful asset to a community. Maybe not a huge resource for woodworking, but the same place, they have a very affordable membership with a very well-stocked wood shop and metal shop and all sorts of things. So I will say this: we are trying to get it would be great to have a full list of every makerspace with a wood shop in the country. But if you, a few episodes back, we did a call out. If you have a makerspace around you, please just send an email into, what is our email address? shoptalk@taunton.com. And just with a real quick subject line, makerspace, name of the makerspace, what state you're in, and maybe a email address or a website. And we're going to try and get a page going with broken down by state, all of the makerspaces and community wood shops that are available to people, because it's such a great resource.
We used to have that. I'm sure Mike remembers. I'll bet you it lives on the website somewhere still. That's the clubs.
That's clubs. Yep.
Yeah.
But this is, I think that the makerspaces are kind of a different deal. I think the club pages is still very important. And I think woodworking clubs are very important. But I know for me, sometimes I'm just looking for access to a CNC machine, so.
Oh, that's cool.
Aren't we all?
Yeah, we had an awesome makerspace in Portland that recently closed. It closed right before the pandemic. I think economic problems, but yeah, it was awesome. You could go in there, learn all this mixed media, just like in clubs, these have clothing all the time. So I went in and I worked with a welder there on an article about welding for woodworkers. And they just had so many different types of things you could learn, a lot of digital fabrication tools. So if you're young and you're more of a digital native, you'd love it in a makerspace,
Oh, the oldies can get into a makerspace too. Come on.
Yeah. Even Mike might like it. Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, let's see. Let's go a different kind of nerdy. Let's go deep into some hand plane physics here, Mike. This one is from Scott. I have a Wood River number 62 bevel up smoother. I have it razor sharp and can get wispy thin shavings. My struggle is that when a board feels smooth in my hand, it seems to just be, the plane just seems to just be skipping across the high spots. And I can never seem to get a full length shaving or any shaving at all. I recently watched Tom McLaughlin's video on using hand plane. Does this mean that I have to keep on hand planing for hours and hours to get that finished surface? I don't like what sanding does to the finished surface. I'd love to get a hand plane finish. So Mike, what do you think's going on here?
If you're set up for a super thin shaving, if you're set up somewhere between 1,000th and 2,000ths of an inch, and you have to take out a 16th inch hollow out of a board, that's a lot of swipes. So, it could be a situation where you're going from too out of flat to your final smoothing in one go. So a couple things you can do is just set up for a heavier cut, or ideally get a second plane, maybe put a very slight camber on there and use that to get basically flat. And then once you're basically flat, then your smoothing plane can take over. Kind of like you're coming off the machines. The first passes of your hand plane is the exact same thing as the coarsest grit of sandpaper you're using if you're not hand planing. And they're very different. That coarsest grit of sandpaper, its job is to basically flatten everything. and get rid of defects, get rid of snipe and burn marks and all that kind of stuff. Once that's done, every other grit of sandpaper, all it's doing is refining that scratch pattern that the heavy, coarse sandpaper left until it's so fine that it feels smooth. So a hand plane is the first swipe of the hand plane is kind of doing that same thing. It's also doing one more thing that a sanding by hand is not going to do, and that sanding is really good for smoothing. A hand plane is really good at flattening, and those are two different things. So if you have an undulating surface, you can smooth that undulating surface with sandpaper. It's going to be glass smooth, but it's still going to be undulating. Where a hand plane, it likes to take high spots off until it reaches the lowest spot. And that's where you could be getting into trouble because, a hand plane is really good at flattening. It can be good at smoothing too if it's set up properly and you're taking nice shavings. Or it could be flattening while it's unsmoothing if you're leaving plane tracks and tear out from the hand plane. That's where the big challenge is in terms of a learning curve for hand planing. So basically, it sounds like if you're taking really fine shavings and it's still hit and miss, you kind of missed that first step of getting basically flat before you start to smooth. So either set up for a slightly heavier cut. It's going to leave more plane tracks, maybe a little bit more tear out, but once it's basically flat, you resharpen, dial in for a really smooth cut, and then you're just removing those smaller surface defects, and you're probably going to have better luck. So if I had to spend hours on a board to get it flat and smooth, I wouldn't be hand plating. That's not the point. It shouldn't be that long for you. I would really, if I'm not sure what surface you're working on. So if it's basically coming off a joiner and planer and things are basically flat, then taking a heavier cut will get you there. Also having a second plane, which is set up for a little bit heavier cut, which is what I like to do. I tend to use my 4 and 5 tend to be set up the same in terms of sharpness, but I'll tend to do my major flattening with the number 5, and it just keeps my number 4 sharper longer. So that's a good reason for extra hand plane. Even if you have 2 number 4s and you treat them a little bit differently, it's not a bad way to go.
Yeah, I definitely have an old Stanley non-bedrock, just the standard run-of-the garden variety Stanley number 4 that I keep at a coarser cut. And then I eventually did treat myself to a Lee Nielsen number 4, and I keep that super tight, super fine, just like Mike's saying. But Mike, it's funny, when I read this question, I was a little bit lost about the problem. And my best guess was the other part that needs to be flat, which is the sole of the plane has to be flat. And I was wondering but now that I hear your explanation, I think it's far more likely that you're right. But I was also wondering if maybe his sole, he did watch Tom McLaughlin's thing about how to set up for successful hand planing. So maybe he knows that or he or she know that the sole has to be super flat, especially around the blade throat opening. But I don't know if that could also be something. It would just, yeah.
It's a wood river, so it's a newer plane. I'm going to assume it is pretty flat. If your sole is not flat, what's going to happen is that you'll try to take a cut and you'll set the blade, more and more, project it more and more until it takes a cut. And typically what'll happen is it'll take a super heavy cut right at the beginning, and then it won't take a cut, and then it'll take a really heavy cut at the end. It'll be really hit and miss, but it'll be violently hit and miss to where the blade has to be so deep to cut that it's going to hit really hard in some places and still skate in other places. Definitely if I have an old Stanley or something and that's causing problems, flattening the sole can often be a huge issue with older planes. Yeah. I just looked it up. The Wood River number 62 is a bevel up jack. So
there you
go.
We're dealing with a longer plane as well. So, and Scott, I'm the type who I have a bevel up jack and then I have a number 3. And that's pretty much, besides for my little weird hand planes, but that's pretty much all I use. I will flatten with the bevel up jack. And then, but if I am looking to smooth, I'm going to a smaller, shorter plane. So that plane's more likely to follow the dips and the peaks and valleys of a not perfectly flat board.
Right.
Now, 9 times out of 10, I'm going the bevel up jack the entire way, and letting it flatten, and then I've got it set up so that I can pretty much get a finished surface off of it as well, by dialing it back. But I think the length of that plane might be playing into it a little bit. What do you
Sure,
think?
because it's acting more as a flattening plane as opposed to a smoothing plane. Yeah.
Yeah, it doubles down on Mike's point about he thinks this is a hit and miss problem with an undulating surface,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that would make even more sense with a long sole like that.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, let's see. Do we have time? Let's do some, do we want to do an all-time favorite tool or something, or technique or smooth move before we hit the break?
Sure.
I'm happy to do that, but you guys better go first because you didn't prepare me for that. So now I have to do a little brainstorming.
Asa, you probably, this is like the second podcast in a row that somebody was like, oh, I didn't know that we had to, you probably created the all-time favorite technique of all time.
I didn't, I haven't listened lately and I didn't know if you guys were still doing it. So I'll brainstorm.
Yeah. No, we actually, the difference is we do potpourri. So it's whatever you want. We're not all picking the same thing now. So that's why we don't communicate it in advance.
Yeah.
Mike, do you want to go?
Yeah, and if I just said this, just strike this, just erase this portion, I'll come up with something else. But I am in the process of, I had made a little tea chest a number of years ago, and it had a really cool, it had a lid which was hinged, so you would fold half of it to access half of the chest, and then you'd slide it over to access the other half. And it's one of these projects I made just with scraps in my shop, and I threw a lot of different techniques at it just because I wanted to try them out. And it's this little thing that I really liked, and I decided to teach that for the first time this year. So I went back to kind of dial in the proportions and remake it so I can get all my tool setups and my processes down to do it. And it just reminded me that scale can be such a complicating factor, where making something small, like I can hinge a door in my sleep. I mean, I've made dozens of hinge jigs and taught dozens and dozens of classes of hanging doors. And then I went to hinge this stupid little folding top with these 3/4 inch wide Brusso hinges. And it was so fussy. I was like shimming out these hinges with little pieces of paper underneath and behind it. And it's like, I'm in trouble because I'm going to have to get 2 classes worth of students through this thing. And, I stepped back. I actually ended up remaking the prototype for a second time from scratch. I just remade the whole thing. And just with that different mindset and the care and sort of really thinking about things. And then I went back into the house. I said, well, how did I do it last time? Because it didn't seem that tough. And I went back to the original boxes oh, well, this is really crappy. These hinges aren't lined up at all. And I remember I used hinges too big and I had to grind them down because it was just sort of more of a study, so it's oh, okay, yeah. So it's just that notion of small is not easier. Sometimes smaller is more difficult just because any offsets, any mistakes proportionately to the overall scale of the piece is much more dramatic. So it was a nice, now that I did the second one and I'm really happy with it and I took some greater care and it turned out the way I was hoping the first one would turn out, it's not so traumatic, but it was still a huge learning experience. And now I know that actually the focus of these 2 classes is it's a smaller project where we have more time for the details, but also more time to actually spend on small details inherent to a smaller piece, which is super important. So yeah, small's not always easier.
Hey, Ben, can I do 3 really quick little ones that are all on a theme?
Yeah, sure. Whatever. There's no rules.
All right. Awesome. Good. All right. I'm going to do 10 then.
I'm not Pernick.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he's gone. Let us not speak of him ever again. No, I'm just kidding. I love him. We're still in touch. He's awesome. So these are 3 little table saw gizmos that I resisted for a long time. And now how sometimes you see gizmos and you sort of resist for a while. And then, so they're all in that category. So speaking of small parts, a lot of times when you're processing little parts, like for small boxes and stuff, you might miter them on a table saw. And I've tried all different ways of holding them in place. The little pencil eraser is great. You can flip your pencil over and just hold things in place with a pencil, kind of safe distance away. But I just started getting those little Destaco plunge toggle clamps and just mounting them on a little block. And now I have a box full of those things in all different configurations. And I just use them on so many different jigs. I use them on router table jigs where they become the handles that I'm holding onto. They're just get yourself a little collection of those. The other table saw thing that I resisted forever was the little Wixie cube, the little digital cube that magnets on. And now that I have it, it's changed so much, like how I work. I always know when my blade's back to 90. I can set it at an angle accurately. I even learned from another woodworker to turn if I want to cut really accurate miters on like frame pieces, I can turn those upright against my miter gauge, like more vertically standing on edge, and use my Wixie to bevel the blade over to the angle that I want, because it's so accurate, that little cube. And then and I use it all over the shop. It's awesome. The third one is my saw stop. You're always trying to get zero clearance. And now Infinity and someone else, they make these throat plates for the saw stop with a little dovetailed insert that slides in and out.
Good luck finding them. No.
So great. Oh, they're sold out right now?
Killing me. I've got so many alerts set up for the new, because I've been trying to buy one for the new shop. I think I have like alerts on 3 different emails, like in case like
someone else makes one. Dig around. I think there's a competitive model out there. I think somebody else makes one, but yeah, those are awesome. So that's my little, all centered on the table saw, all little tools that I resisted and now I've embraced.
All good ones. And we all are confident enough to admit that we're buying our Destaco clamps at Harbor Freight, right?
Yeah.
I'll get them wherever, as long as they work.
Well, that's actually, in the past, people have emailed in and said, what is a Destaco clamp? Because it's one of those, how do I spell what they just said in order to Google this? And, but they're just little flip down clamps that you screw onto a sled or a fixture or something like that. You screw on one part and then there's a handle and it just clamps down to something else. And
little rubber tip. Yeah. I mean, it's there. You can find them at your local woodworking retailer for $25 a piece. And so the first, I would have like 2 or 4, and every time I need them, I would unscrew them from whatever jig they were on and use them. And then Harbor Freight, it's even got like the same little number stamped on the side of it for like $5 a pop. And I just buy them by the bushel, and they're just everywhere. And whenever I get to the point where I run out and I have to take them off something else, it's like, you probably have way too many jigs set up.
You do.
So
I think the generic name is toggle clamp. If you're looking generically on Google, I think it's just toggle. Yeah,
I've been milking the same too for about 10 years. I need one. I sit there and I scan the shop and go, where is it? And it's always on one stupid jig in the garage or something.
Yeah.
Well, you need the plunge style too. I love the plunge style that comes straight down with just a straight plunge action. That's good on the fence of your miters on your.
I've never experienced the joy. Never experienced that joy. Okay, so my all-time favorite tool of all time for this week, Mike, you scared me because I thought you were going to repeat yourself. I will actually repeat myself because it got cut from the last episode due to it being an hour and 4 long already. My all-time favorite tool of all time for this week is I have a little set of stacking canisters that are probably used for like beadwork or something like that. Each one screws into the lid of the one below it. And I have it just filled with different sawdusts and mahogany sawdust, cherry sawdust. The fretboard material I use, rich light sawdust, maple sawdust. The other day I was doing white cream dyed veneer work and I needed some. So I went over to the oscillating spindle sander, which is where I like to gather my sawdust from for fill material. And you know what? I'm not too proud to admit I'm filling gaps in marquetry, and I'm, dropping fills and all sorts of things. And if you have the right sawdust on hand, it goes a long, long way to making it an invisible repair that you don't feel the need to point out anytime someone's
Very cool. So. Are they the clear plastic that screw together?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So, yeah. But, pick them up at like Michael's or a hobby shop or something.
Or in
like
the
that.
fishing tackle section, I use those to keep all my fly fishing flies, and each, got that whole little stack of them. Yeah. And only the top one has a lid. On all the other ones, the upper portion acts as a lid to the lower one.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are cool.
Yeah. So it's just,
Ben, do you have any tips for like how to, I was just going to say, do you have any tips for how to mix up the sawdust and glue so it doesn't turn too dark on you? Because sometimes it gets darker than the wood. I
do it in phases. So I will drop some in, and I use thin CA glue. And that matches a finished piece better than wood glue.
Cool.
Great tip.
Yeah, and I do it in phase, and I don't try and fill it all at once. And I also will take a little like artist palette knife and try and jam as much of that dust in there as humanly possible, because the minute you hit it with CA glue, it will settle just a little bit. And sometimes you find yourself coming back to it 10 times. I want to come back to it twice. But CA glue for those little fills, the only time that I find that there is a noticeable difference in the color of the wood is on side grain cherry. It just darkens just a bit more than the rest of it. But everything else I do, you'd have a hard time picking it out. So, yeah.
Cool.
All right, let's take a break. Since 1928, Woodcraft has been outfitting woodworkers and their shops with everything woodworkers want. Whether it's the world's best tools you're looking for, or that special species of wood for your next project, Woodcraft has been helping you make wood work for more than 90 years. Visit woodcraft.com or shop one of their 75 stores nationwide to create something cool. Question number 3 is from Chris. What is your recommendation for how to fair a curved surface? I've tried bandsawing to a line, spindle sanding best I can, and then using a scraper and sandpaper, but it still ends up looking and feeling ridgy. I don't know if that's a word, but I like it, ridgy. Is there a foolproof way to fair an edge, or should I just stick to rectilinear furniture? I love how it's like, is there a way to do this, or am I just making everything straight from here on out? So.
That's funny.
Asa, what's your go-to when you're getting your curve on?
Yeah, I was going to say that I tend to err on the side of, I tend to lean toward power tools and love hand tools, but this is a place where I power sand. And I think because he's talking about a spindle sander that he's talking about concave curves, but just in case he's using a spindle sander on outside curves, let's talk about both, Yeah,
so, good point.
Yeah. So inside curves, concave curves, which is what I think he's probably talking about, you want to have your spindle or your sanding surface to be as close to the arc of your curve as you can. That's number one. So like if you have a spindle sander, that would mean putting on your biggest drum. And most of the curves in woodworking for furniture making anyway tend to be very shallow, hence the challenge that we're all up against. They're shallow curves with a smaller diameter sanding surface. It's the danger is you get bumps, right? But the first step is to put the biggest possible spindle on your machine that you have, or use the end of a belt sander that's open, whatever the biggest thing is. What some people do who are pros is they'll often insert like a curved platen, you could call it, into their belt sander or their edge sander. They'll put like a curved, like a semicircular chunk of wood or in there, or even buy sanders that let you do that. But I've seen people just shop make their own. And they'll throw it in there, and that makes a very shallow curve on the face of their belt sander. And they'll use it specifically for making templates if they do a lot of curved work. So if you can create some kind of a sideways belt sander, whether it's like the rigid that we have or whatever, and somehow mount a curved platen in there, that's the best, because you can get the shape of that platen to be so close to the shape of what you're sanding that it's harder to make bumps. Then the other thing is technique. And I like to creep up to the line. First of all, draw a really dark line. It's easy to obscure your line or go past it, and then you're really up a creek. So make a line and try not to go past it, because once you lose your line, you have no reference. So make a line with a drawing tool that makes a fair curve as a start, like a drawing bow or whatever, and then make that line really pronounced, and then slowly with shallow passes on the sander, light passes, work your way up to that line. That's one thing.
Make sure it's just one line. Like, don't have multiple sketchy lines and like, oh, I'll know which one to follow. You won't. Yeah.
Yeah. And then on flat, then, if it's an outside curve, you want to not use your spindle sander. That's step number one, because that's obviously going to make a bumpy surface. So, in that case, you want to be on a flat belt, some kind of a side flat belt, like the rigid sanding unit that me and Ben have. And it's the same. All the tips are the same. There's muscle memory that you build up. One really cool way to see if your surface is ridgy, or let's just say bumpy, is to tip it up on a hard surface, like your table saw, whatever. You'll hear little bumps as you hit little high spots. You'll hear and feel little bumps. And so that's a good way to tell also. And one last tip on outside surfaces and inside, if you have a cutoff left over from cutting that surface, you can stick sandpaper to the cutoff and use that as a sanding block. So these are just a few of the tips I use. That's the power tool sanding side. I don't know, Mike, I thought maybe you would want to talk about spoke shaves and compass planes and stuff. I don't know if you use that stuff.
Compass planes?
Yeah.
What is he, a wheelwright?
Exactly the same concept, where there's two things: fairing, which is truing the curve, and then smoothing, which is getting rid of the bump. So it can be fair and bumpy, or it can be smooth and not fair. Both of those things are bad. So on outside curves, start with a block plane. On really shallow inside curves, block plane, skew it. Chances are that's going to be able to handle a lot of subtle inside curves as well. I find a block plane, if you skew the blade, it can sort of bridge the up and downs a little bit to get you smoother faster. For tighter inside curves, a spoke shave is good. You can even use a spoke shave on outside curves. The reason being is that it's got a really, really short blade, and your hands are right on top of the very short sole, and so that you're able to find center a little bit easier. You can technically use a number 4, number 5 hand plane on outside curves, but because you're sort of trying to balance it right where the blade is cutting, it can be a little bit more difficult. But people often ask what kind of spoke shave they should get. They think that they need a flat one for the outside and maybe a curved one for inside. Get a flat. You can handle almost every inside curve with a flatter spoke shave. And you're going to be able to reference off the front and back of the sole as you're making the cut. You're going to have a little bit better luck. And if it's super tight, you can go to files. You can go to a scraper. The main thing is that there's no one surefire way, but you need a lot of methods in order to tackle this job, because it's a very fundamental woodworking skill. And the bottom line, Asa was getting to rocking. Use my fingers. I use a lot, and nothing is like automatic. Nothing is mindlessly going to give you a fair curve. So even if you're at a spindle sander, I'm always feeling, is there a bump? I'll mark it with a pencil. I'll work in that area, feel that again. If I'm using a spoke shave or hand plane, you're always feeling how fair that curve is.
Me too.
And working those areas as you go, because it's just not going to fare itself without some intent and without some thought to it.
Fingertips. I'm totally with you. It's like one of the miracles of the universe is fingertip sensory, ability.
Fingertips, dude. They're so cool. I deal with curves a lot, and I wound up with, I have a whole drawer filled with weird shaped offcuts and sandpaper stuck to them. And I open up that drawer and just find the one that fits. And one of my go-tos lately is I've got, well, here's it's, you know, just a stick of Rich Light, and about half of an inch wide that I will apply sandpaper to. And one good thing for really tight curves is you're not trying to get the piece to fit inside the curve. You're trying to get 2 points of reference or two points of contact, whether it's a file or a sanding stick or whatever. And because if you're hitting it with one small point of contact, you're gonna fall into that dip whenever you're sanding it or cutting it with a scraper or whatever. You're going into that dip, and the ridge or that dip is not getting out. You have to do everything around that dip, you know? So sometimes it'll be a flexible sanding block made out of hardboard, or a piece of I have a piece of like binder plastic or something a really, really thin a really, really thin cutting board that I will apply sandpaper to. But what you're trying to do for me is not to, if you're trying to fair that curve and get all the ridges out, you're trying to bring everything down to the level of that ridge in a smooth way. And the only way of doing that is by not touching that ridge until the very last minute. So there's just so many things that I have around this shop that I use for all these teeny tiny things. I do have curved spoke shaves. I actually have like a teeny tiny, it's almost a cigar spoke shave that I just got from Heartwood Tools that, you know, can get into, I think it's a 1/2 inch radius or something like that. But all sorts of things. But for me, the absolute go-to is a small stick of wood with sandpaper glued to it or stuck to it. And just finding the way to get in that little thing without getting in that dip is really the key for me. But I think...
Okay, I was just going to say, I think the Michael Fortune tip that I use all the time is just sandpaper on a flexible piece of like 1/4 inch MDF, sort of getting like it's going to bend to fit the curve. And to your point, Ben, it's going to ride over the hollows and allow you to fair that whole surface.
Yeah. So, you know, like a hand plane,
100%. Yeah.
Like a hand plane, you want, when you're flattening a thing, we're going right back to the second question now. But when you're flattening a board, and it's just hitting those high spots, that means the board isn't flat. When you're sanding a curve with a long, flexible sanding pad or whatever, it's just hitting those high spots. And that's, you know, but that's how you're going to fare it. So same way to get something flat.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm always, you know, my mind is really with beginners a lot and intermediates these days. And I'm always thinking of like doing more with less. And I love that tip of like a thick rubber backer or a 1/4 inch piece of MDF. That's a low tech way to bridge those gaps and hit those high spots. It'll flex to almost any curve. Yeah, that's great. I love those really low tech approaches. You could do a ton with 1/4 inch MDF and sandpaper on it because it'll flex in both directions. It'll hit the high spots. That's an awesome one too.
Yeah.
Ben, I wish you would have answered that question first, because once you started talking, it's like, oh no, I was like mansplaining fairing curves to an instrument maker. It's
no, because we all have different existences, you know? And it's like my existence is constantly trying to get this little thing perfectly faired now, you know? That's what I spend all my time doing sometimes. But you know, it's and I'll tell you, the drawer of random cutoffs with sandpaper, with sticky back sandpaper on it. Oh, it's always a good drawer. I love that drawer. All right, well, I think that about does it. Do y'all have anything to bring up? How are we getting your book, Asa?
It's on the Taunton website. It's on Amazon, you can just set my name and build stuff with wood or build more stuff with wood and in my name. You guys could throw a link. Amazon has the least expensive price. I think the new book's $25 on Amazon. And it's thicker than the first book. So, bonus.
Cool.
Are you selling any signed copies or anything?
Not yet. I'm talking to the marketing department tomorrow, so maybe we'll get that popping.
Right on. Let's see. I don't know if I have any random recommendations or anything. Mike, do you have anything? You always have like something weird to talk about at the end.
Shout out to Kate Swan at Florida School of Woodworking for my Akira Satake teacup. Sweet. And
that was incredible.
School. Yeah.
Yeah. Kate's had some great teachers there lately.
Yeah.
Well, that does it for this episode of Shop Talk Live. If you have any questions, comments, or conversation starters, please send them into shoptalkathon.com. If you like, please leave a comment for us either on the show notes page or even on YouTube. It's great engagement. It helps us to know, what's working, what's not working. And as always, 5-star reviews on iTunes helps everyone find out more about Shop Talk Live. If you're watching on YouTube, please click that thumbs up button. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. Thanks for listening.